again. The main thing is, can you all hear me? Can you all see me? Can you see the screen? We might turn some lights off. I don't know if there's front lights, but if you can't see the screen, I don't know if we can turn the front light set off and maybe see if that's better or worse than mine. Okay, well, let me know if not. So I thought I'd introduce myself a little bit. I'm Tracy Randle. In undergraduate, I studied Cape history and archaeology here at UCT, and I did my master's thesis on the history of wine tourism of the Western Cape in 2004, and how many wine estates were working with and presenting heritage to the public. I then worked for a wine estate for 12 years as their historian and curator, which was Solom's Delta Wine Estate. And we did a lot of community heritage work, as well as museums, a music exhibition and project, a Cape music project, which ended up into a exhibition and museum. And then in 2016, started to work for other museums and exhibitions and started my PhD on curatorship at Nicolaas. So you'll see a little bit of all of those interests actually in this talk that will come up. And if I have got quite a lot to get through, which worries me that I won't get through it all, so if I can just try and present, and then perhaps I still want to keep at least 15-20 minutes for discussion. So if you could keep any questions you have, I think, until the end, just to make sure I get through all the material. So just by a show of hands, how many of you have been at the last 2 days? Lecture, so just about everyone. And how many of you have worked in the Cape Archives before? Or been in the okay, so also a few. Obviously, I know that Antonia would have told you a huge amount about the documents like the household inventories, and they're pulled into sources also in Helena's talk yesterday. So I'm going to try not to duplicate anything, but I wasn't actually here. So, but I will just do an overview, and just as a reminder, I'm sure Antonio told you, but there's also this book which is for sale, which I think the last 5 copies in the world are upstairs, but it is available online in a PDF format as well. So it depends if you like an actual book, which sometimes I do, or if you want it digitally, which is available. So I'm speaking today about household inventories at the Cape, but I'm kind of taking it through looking at what types of information we can get from them, which I think you would have heard about in the last 2 days, but then also wanting to show you what can we do with that information, what kind of stories can we build up with it. So this is the household inventory, which I'm sure Antonia would have showed you as well. But it's found in the Cape Archives. This is the original document. This one dates to 1706, and it's all in this MOOC series, which is the Master of the Orphan Chamber. Now, we have household inventories that roughly date from 1673 to 1834, so that's quite a good long period that we have representation for. They aren't fully representational, having said that, because it's not absolutely everyone that's at the Cape. It's often not always the very wealthy people, because they have all their estate papers in order. And what these documents are really about is when someone dies and their estate has to be divided up in terms of partable inheritance at the Cape. And making sure, unlike Europe, that the wife and the children are all getting fair and equal shares. So not the firstborn son inherits everything, but actually everyone gets a portion of the estate of the deceased person. And sometimes they can be very simple, but of course, as people tended to have multiple marriages due to the death rate of people not living very long, it becomes seriously complicated. Actually, when you have multiple sets of children from different marriages, and you get to someone who's on their 3rd marriage, and they've all got different partners, so you can imagine. But it's really interesting because it's actually what it reveals about all those kinds of interrelationships. So in the basic household inventory, let's see if this comes up as a pointer. Where's it gone? Okay, we might not find it as a pointer. Let's see. There it is. There we go. So So in all of the inventories, we get a small description of who is deceased right at the beginning, and you can see it's the Landbouwer, and then it says Arno Jans, and then his deceased wife is obviously one of the person who's mentioned in the testator. So we have a lot of family information. It mentions all the heirs, and you can actually reconstruct a little family network. This is actually the estate inventory for Arno Jans, who was the first owner of the property Speer in Stellenbosch, and so he died in 1706, and his estate was inventoried. It's all of these pages. This is his property, and it's quite sparse. I mean, we're talking about he did have Speer itself at the stage, which is described here. And then it says another house, Ian Hayes Stander in Tafel Valley. So he had two properties, but pretty much cattle, pistols, guns, a wagon, and some farming implements. No household furnishings are mentioned. But this is actually the very first detailed description we have for Speer Wine Farm. So that's within this little portion, which is extremely handy to know what was happening economically on the farm already by 1706. So obviously this is all in Dutch, but as a translation it says, a piece of wheat grain land lying in Stellenbosch, 40 morgen in size, built with a living house, a cow enclosure, a sheep enclosure, a horse enclosure, a pressing house, and a grain or wheat house. So that's quite in detail. We're actually getting quite a full picture of the economic, what's happening on that farm at that very early date. It's also actually the first time that we have written down that there is actually a pressing house, a space that was dedicated to wine. So, this is potentially the first kind of documented building we have as a type of wine processing center in the Cape. And they obviously were making it very early on. And it also shows here that he owned 2 male slaves, which we just find enumerated here. And as well as a slave woman with 3 children. And his widow, Hendrina Jensen, she just signs here. This is her signature. And that's it. So that's the estate. And there is, which I'm sure Antonia would have told you about as well, there is an online version which has been digitized, which is on the TANAP website. And you don't have to fight your way through the script. So this is actually, you don't even have to go into the archives. It's available online, and it's the inventories of the orphan chamber. It's not, I don't think it's the absolute full series, which you can also get on the Antonia's kind of web page. But here you can obviously see it's much easier to read, and what's really great about it is that it's also searchable. So you can search for individual artifacts or people's names or place names in every kind of imagined spelling. I'm not going to go too much into this. I just wanted to tell you that it exists and that it's very handy. So the one thing I showed you is the household inventories, which really shows you, as I said, things that people owned, financial information. It often shows you the debtors and the creditors, signatures, as we saw, and that type of information, you don't use that document in isolation. You have to use it in relation to title deeds, wills, census documents. Also insolvent estates are amazing, full moments in time where people went bankrupt, and then you can just about get every part of their lives revealed of what they were eating on the table. Court cases, of course, also show you a huge amount of information. So all of that, is part of the picture. But I'm specifically going to talk about household inventories and also auction lists. So auction lists, in comparison, is a different series. So the household inventories is the MOOC 8 series, and this is the MOOC 10 series. And it's a slightly later date. They run or Vendu roll, they run from 1691 to 1834. And it's not totally that you may find a household inventory and an auction list. You may actually only find one or the other. Sometimes you find both. Sometimes, in this case, we actually had a household inventory of Arno Jans. And this is it says the inventory, but it's actually the auction list of then his wife when she died, Hendrina van der Jensen. And what makes them slightly different, of course, is that we are finding that it's when things come up for sale. So it's all those artifacts that have been listed often room by room, as Antonia would have told you. So what's sitting in the voorkamer, but now it's up for public sale. And what's really interesting about it is that you're often getting who's buying each individual thing. So just a little bit more about this one. In 1710, so 4 years after her husband dies, Hendrina van der Jensen, she dies. And her inventory, which is actually many more pages longer, represents actually a much fuller picture of the running life of Speer. So this is the auction register of the property, and it includes a detailed list of household items. It doesn't show you room by room anymore. It's just, an auction list. So we don't have any idea of where these things were positioned, like in a household inventory we might find. But what we have many more household items, winemaking equipment, and who purchased it. So at this stage, just 4 years later, it seems that Speer was a very prosperous and well-equipped farm, and they actually had quite high status goods. So items included 7 small paintings, as well as porcelain plates and platters. And keeping in mind at this stage, only the very wealthy had porcelain, which I'll come to a bit later, but it was mostly everyone had pewter tableware in these early days. She also had a little hand-painted case and fountain, mirrors, a clothing brush. And her son-in-law, really interestingly, purchased many items from the sale. So then you think, well, okay, what was he purchasing? Do they have meaning in relation to his parents-in-law? So he bought farming implements, machinery, building materials, 2 guns. He bought the 7 small paintings, which makes you wonder, are these potentially family portraits? Because obviously they've got all just sentimental pieces of family material culture. As well as a mere gelding. Now the 3 children of Arno and Hendrina, they bought a lot of 292 sheep and a further lot of 84 big and small sheep. So what we're thinking is that they're most likely running Speer in partnership, although it was only formally sold to the 2 brothers, Hermanus and Jan Dirks Jans. And the second owner of Speer, Hans Hendrik Hatting, who was actually present at this auction, and he was already buying items, even though the property he didn't buy it at this particular auction. So we can already see that potentially he's thinking about it. He knows them. He actually purchased the majority of the vats of wine that were produced on the farm, and we also find, by looking at who was attending the auction and purchasing things, the kind of social relationships potentially between people. And there were also quite well-known and elite neighboring farmers, such as Adam Tuss and these pachters, which is people who have I suppose what would be the VOC monopolies for trading in certain respects, like the meat pachter. So he's the official supplier of meat to the VOC. But I'm going to come a bit more to that. But I just wanted to give you, I'm telling you some of these details as an example, because I think what we can see already just working with these 2 inventories and the auction roll is that we can start to reconstruct the material life of the Cape inhabitants and how their house was furnished, what they wore, sometimes even we can see what spices, cooking implements they used. And you can start to see the wider social networks in relation to these material things. So who purchased what matters, and what they owned and how they displayed it, in what rooms they displayed, had social meaning. And just to show you, this is the first list within this auction that we have the names of the slaves of the farm. So whereas before in the household inventory we only had one or 2 male slaves and 1 slave woman and 3 children, we don't know who they are and where they come from. Whereas in this next document, we're starting to see now a slave, Hannibal from Batavia, and who purchased him and for how much. And Peter van der Kaap, Casper from Batavia, the slave woman Anna, and who they were sold to. So now we can start to also reconstruct the slave family on Spear during this period, and it consisted of 2 male slaves from Batavia, Hannibal and Casper, the slave woman Anna and her 3 children, and that was Peter, Pedro, and Tobias. In all of these slave documents, we just about never get who the father is, for all sorts of various reasons. Another slave named Paris was also sold at this auction, so he might have been purchased or born into the family in the 4-year period between the 2 documents that we have. But the entire slave family was sold to different owners at the auctions, except for 2. The 2 brothers, Pedro and Tobias, were sold to the same buyer, and it was the son-in-law again. And I think what's really interesting throughout many of these inventories and auction records is that slaves were very, very often sold within the family networks. But you also have to keep in mind that slaves were, like property, one of the ways that people accumulated wealth and status. So, and actually for 120 years later, we were able to find in the archives in the slave office records that for the Van der Bijl family who owned the farm at the time, and over 50 slaves, almost that entire family of slaves was sold within the family networks or bequeathed within the family networks. So there's really interesting and complicated sets of relationships that are going on here between owners and slaves and how they can be bequeathed. You could take out a mortgage against your slave. And if you couldn't pay it back, your slave was repossessed. I mean, it's totally different times to even imagine. But, so these inventories and auction lists provide a rich, and obviously you can see it's quite accessible, is some of it even online, resource to the lives of a wide range of people who lived at the Cape. So it's, it's also some rich, poor, young, old, men, women, and children. We get a little bit into slaves and servants, and also freed slaves, because we get into kind of their, what they owned once they were free, which was documented. So in many ways, this is the material life of the ancestors of us in the Cape today. And while many of them may have been ordinary, many of these were just ordinary people, we have to keep in mind that they still predominantly fell within the realms of colonial settlement and the system. So despite there are many references to enslaved people, but it is primarily as being as property possessed. It's how do we get into the lives of Hannibal and Peter? It's extremely difficult to go beyond this. And although I know Helena Liebenberg, she might have spoken about yesterday some of the lives and the material culture of freed slaves and Muslim exiles at the Cape and Stellenbosch. So we get these kind of pockets or windows at certain periods, but there's also scant evidence of indigenous lives within any of the set of documents. And it's because of the specific bureaucratic eye of the Dutch government. And the most piercing reason for this is that the VOC system only started to recognize indigenous people as people in the 19th century. So civil rights were only conferred on indigenous Khoi people and other free persons of color only as late as 1823, and it was more about control, Ordinance 50, and control and movement of indigenous people, trying to tie them more as labor to farms. But just to go back to a little bit about the social lives and material culture of the kind of late 17th and early 18th century, this period can be seen as a time of new identity construction, especially for this Cape Free Burger population in relation to the VOC company. So you must imagine the VOC, as you all know, is, it's a trading company. It's not the Dutch government. It's Coca-Cola, who has set up a spot here at the Cape. And Coca-Cola is handing out land and making all sorts of governmental decisions. And as Yvonne Brick argued in her work on material culture at the Cape during this period, land ownership had effectively shifted the perceived status of these former VOC employees who were granted relatively large parcels of land. So we're looking at completely impoverished VOC soldiers, mostly actually from Germany, a lot from Scandinavia, and they were freed from from company service. In their homelands, I mean, they really would have been on the bottom rungs of society. And now they have this privilege, normally the sole preserve of aristocracy and the clergy of Europe, to own land. But of course, the company itself was determined not to recognize their change in status. They're still trying to control these burghers, and they've now allocated land and freed them from company service. So the VOC was consistently trying to rein in the autonomy of these free burghers, but this new land-owning class, in response, was determined to assert their own gentrified status and identity, often through overt action, like the monopoly by Simon van der Stel, and coming into resistance against that. And Yvonne Brink also argues through symbolic discourse. So this discourse does not refer solely to the realm of written language, but to brick and stone, porcelain and cloth, spaces and shapes. So Brink explored the notion that the Freeburger farm dwellings, these first early homesteads, were indicative of this new constructed identity through their growth and development, a huge display of symmetrical order, and it gave solid evidence of owners able to create and maintain order without VOC intervention, and to act independently, that they are capable of discernment, and therefore that they could command respect and be treated as equals rather than as obedient servants of the VOC. So the Freeburger's plot, literally his place, stood in clear contrast to the inferior social place designated to him by the company. So in the same vein, what Freeburgers or colonists chose to consume in terms of goods they purchased to furnish their households or wear upon their bodies could be a reflection of this perceived and newly constructed social status and land-owning identity. So we're kind of saying that the types of things that we're finding in their houses and where they're positioned and what they're wearing, the type of fabrics that they're wearing, that all actually very much matters. Not that they had, so this is just a beautiful kind of picture from Robert Jacob Gordon and one of these early farmsteads of very much, you can see control over the environment and symmetrical order. And I suppose in many ways, you know, a taming and ownership over space that, you know, potentially was considered quite wild maybe by Europeans. But of course, what did they buy and where did they buy it and how did they buy it? There was not a wide variety of choices in terms of purchasing goods where that was concerned, because at the Cape, these household in auctions that we're seeing, these vendus that are happening, were critically important in an economy where free trade was highly limited and regulated by the VOC. So neither burghers or supposedly company officials were permitted to openly run a wholesale or retail shop, as all public trade was strictly the monopoly of the company. So that's where it goes back to these pachters who are having the monopoly of certain parts of being able to supply beer or wine or meat to the company. But of course, as we all know, with everything in life, this does not mean that private trade was absent. In fact, it would almost seem that illicit trade had this ubiquitous presence within almost all echelons of 18th century Cape society. So Antonio Malone found evidence of an illegal tavern being run in the back room of a freed slave, and even a smuggler's den, potentially, in another. She found colonists using their front rooms, their voorkamers, to sell all manner of goods. And we actually find in the estates of widows that they at the Cape that they were running farms on a mass scale. Maybe once their third husband died, they decided not to get another because they'd accumulated enough wealth. And they were absolutely running these farms, and in urban spaces, we know that they were running inns, brothels, tap houses, shops. Just from the sheer quantity sometimes, the unusualness of finding so many items in a front parlour. You know, why would someone have 200 bowls and all of these, and masses of glasses, and you know, there's something going on there. So I mean, it's very, you know, one of the things that struck me is that it's quite similar to what South African society is like at the moment. We're all running these businesses and spas and shops, and you know, beauty salons are taking place in everyone's household. So imagine, but it's much more formally controlled. Of course, the VOC in some way saying this isn't happening, and of course everyone's doing it. So certain goods, for example porcelain, were actually extremely reliant on illicit trade. But as Antonia has explained, everyone had the same limited commodities from which to choose at the Cape. So it would be according to your cultural or financial restraints here. So if we compare it to England at this period, which witnessed an increase in consumption of manufactured goods, so it's a little bit more modern, starting to become industrial, kind of manufactured new goods and clothing during this period, Cape citizens were at the mercy of the import market and the internal circulation of goods within the colony. So the social values that people attributed to these second-hand goods bought at auctions, for instance, actually held meaning for these citizens. And of course, even by, you must also think of it as these auctions are also a moment which is a type of stage set. What I'm buying and you see me buy is also kind of a performance. So I thought I would talk just in a different vein about how these household inventories, I have worked with them to kind of display the material culture that we have in many of the museum collections I've worked on as a different way to kind of enter into them. Porcelain, of course, is one of the most common things that we find in the household inventories and in the auctions. And of course, many archaeologists have studied all the porcelain and historians, and where porcelain is displayed absolutely matters. The only very painful thing about it from the inventories is that we don't get detailed descriptions of what kind of pattern or porcelain it is. We might get that it's Chinese porcelain, it might say blue and white if we're very lucky, but we're not getting specific styles or patterns. So that's quite irritating when you really want to know what it is. But we know that porcelain was displayed within the voorkamers, so in these front rooms of a lot of people's houses where they're displaying their wealth. So here's an example, the interior of a Dutch house at around 1670, and you can see the rack on the wall with the porcelain plates. At the Cape, this would have been in a very public area, so we don't have very many interior shots from this period at the Cape, but that type of rack would have been in a public gathering space within your household, the difference between obviously public and private. What we do find, even though it's not, the patterns aren't documented in these inventories, is that of course we have the archaeological record. So for many sites, we actually find the things. So for example, on Spear, we found these amazing examples of Chinese porcelain, which dates to around 1680s, 1690s. And this is kind of Asian export ware. So it's rougher type of porcelain that came back, And so then we can also start to actually give a visual texture to things that we're seeing in the inventories, but we're digging up actually out the ground. So Chinese porcelain was purchased at the Cape from ship's captains, obviously en route back to Europe, and they were part of official consignments to these markets in Europe from the East. And porcelain was manufactured in China specifically for European markets, and the designs on it were to cater to Western tastes and trends, which is quite interesting. So Chinese porcelain was found at almost every archaeological site in the Cape, and it represents the 17th century trade networks and the Dutch settlement at the Cape. So Chinese porcelain plates, cups, saucers became part of the material world of Cape colonists, and as I said, it's often displayed within public rooms within the house to indicate wealth and status. This is a household inventory of the Huguenot Maria Vito. So this is the inventory here, and we recently opened the new exhibition at the Huguenot Museum last year, and had to rework the collection and the type of story that the museum told. And we looked obviously at household inventories as well of the Huguenots when they died, and to look at the type of material culture and the lives that they had. So the Huguenots at the Cape, for instance, what we can see from their household inventories or auction lists in the early years when they died here, very few were actually recorded as early porcelain in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The household inventories of Huguenot refugees who died in this period actually mostly owned pewter. So, we also imagine sometimes that the Huguenots were these really wealthy elites in the higher echelons of society. They really were, they came with, a bag maybe from France if they came with anything, with a few items, most often books, Bibles, psalters, and psalm books. So of course that also has to change. How do we display that? That affected our display because obviously we have Chinese porcelain pieces within the collection. Marie Vito actually was one of the few Huguenots who had a very small display rack, like I showed you earlier, with porcelain crockery on it, listed in her inventory of 1711. So that was quite unusual that she had a little bit of porcelain. And we also find the later deceased inventories of Sarah Couchet in 1714 and Claude Moret in 1729 also show a little bit of porcelain. But the majority of Huguenots, when you keep looking at these records, are pewter. And the children and grandchildren of Huguenots, the next generation, led far more affluent lives. So, even a Huguenot child who arrived here quite young, their inventories, when they died, showed a much higher standard of wealth than their parents. And of course, that's evidenced even in porcelain, copper kitchenware, books, paintings, wall clocks. So we can literally see the next kind of layer of wealth that's accumulated. So I thought I'd also talk a little bit about the iconic willow pattern, which we find all across archaeological sites. This is absolutely everywhere. So first appearing in the 1790s, the willow pattern is one of the most commonly occurring patterns at Cape archaeological sites. So on many farms in the Western Cape, you will find pieces scattered in between rows of vineyards, lying on mounds, freshly turned up by moles. It's really... And also, I think what's really fascinating is that it remains in our display cabinets, and it ensures that many of us South Africans have grown up with this pattern on our personal stage sets. Everyone often has a willow pattern in some stage of their family. So the willow pattern, really interestingly though, is the most iconic of chinoiserie style prints. Now chinoiserie, I spoke a little bit earlier about how China was creating ceramics and porcelain for European tastes and with European themes and sending that off. Now, chinoiserie is almost the reverse of that. So it's a theme, it's European ceramics and artistic styles since the 17th century, which reflect Chinese artistic influences. So early hints of chinoiserie appear in the 17th century in nations, especially with active East India companies. So these trading companies that are coming into contact with the East are bringing all this material culture and style and pattern back to Europe, and it's a fashion trend. So of course the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. So we find that tin glazed pottery made at Delft and in other Dutch towns adopted the blue and white Ming decoration in the early 19th century. So Delft is a direct response to all of this Eastern porcelain that's coming through. What's really interesting with the willow pattern is that in a fascinating twist, there is no original willow pattern within Chinese imagery. This is actually a composite design. So, you have all sorts of people reflecting each other. So you have, on one side, you have the East who's trying to reflect European tastes, then you have Europe who's reflecting the East, and then you have something new that's made that's a total, imagined East as well. And there's a love story behind the willow pattern, whether true or imagined, and two kind of lovers unrequited love, who are represented with these two birds and all of these kinds of thing behind it. But I actually thought I would take it within the Huguenot Museum. We had a willow pattern to be able to display, and of course later generations of Huguenot descendants would have had willow pattern. But we also chose, in another reverberation of all of these kinds of circulation of styles going around the world, we also have a Cape willow pattern, which is 2017, which is done by the ceramicist and artist Michael Chandler. So the Cape willow pattern, which is what he calls this series, is a range of ceramics inspired by events that took place at the Cape on a farm in the 18th century, and it uses this iconic English willow as its template. But this 21st century version is filled with local imagery now, which tells the story of the Huguenot Marie Mouton and her slave, Titus of Bengal. So, as Michael Chandler explains why did he choose the willow pattern, he says the willow pattern is the most reproduced image of all time, and so it has an innate power that I find really interesting. I have taken the invented narrative of the original willow pattern, a tale of forbidden and tragic love, and retold it with a Cape twist. So I thought I would perhaps tell you a little bit about the story that sits behind this plate, and it's the story of Marie Mouton. On the 2nd of February 1699, a 9-year-old Huguenot refugee, Marie Mouton, arrived at the Cape from Middelburg on the Donkerfleet with her parents, Jacques and Marie, and her sister Madeleine. Another sister, Marguerite, was born during the passage, and her mother died soon afterwards, probably from childbirth complications on board. So now you have this father, Jacques, or Jacob, who, as we find him in the records, to care for this very young family. At the age of 16, which was not uncommon, Marie married Franz Jooster, who was at least 20 years her senior. Marie moved into his homestead at the foot of the Elandskloof Pass, not far from the farm that her father and his new wife, he remarried rather quickly, as you can imagine, to care for these children. In 1714, she was accused of murdering her husband with their slaves, Titus of Bengal and Fortune of Angola, as accomplices. An unusual detail of the case involved hiding Joost's body, her husband's body, within a porcupine hole on the edge of the wheat field. And what was really interesting was that during her trial, Marie testified that her husband had treated her badly and that she had not had new clothing from him in the past 9 years. Now, one of the interesting things that came up when I studied a whole series of these household inventories and auctions was the massive role that cloth played. So we find people of all statuses at the Cape, from the very highest echelons, the masters of the orphan chamber, buying huge, massive rolls and at huge cost of these expensive damask and silk fabrics that might be at an auction. We also find freed slaves buying tracts of cloth. And what's interesting to think about in terms of cloth is that in a very controlled second-hand market where almost nothing is new, a roll of cloth is remade into something new. And of course at the Cape we had sumptuary laws. So with all these freed slaves who were also purchasing, if they had the money, these types of expensive cloths, it got to such a stage that the VOC said that only certain women were allowed to wear hoop skirts, or not freed slaves, they were not allowed to wear hoop skirts or earrings. So what people are wearing really matters, and the style that they're wearing really matters. And the fact that Marie hadn't had new clothing in 9 years from her husband really mattered, because it's not reflecting her social status. Eyewitnesses reported during this case that Marie Mouton and Titus of Bengal were lovers, having committed adultery for considerable time before the murder of her husband. Marie's action of murder and adultery were of course shocking to her contemporaries, in that it specifically involved intimate relations with a slave man. So as historian Nigel Penn, who's written about her story, has explained of her conduct, she was a betrayal both of her gender and her social group. Colonial society as a whole was threatened by her actions, and it was necessary that she be eliminated, and she was. So Marie, Titus, and Fortuyn all suffered sentences of severe and gruesome punishments and death for the murder of her husband. Marie Mouton was the only white woman to be executed in the Cape Colony during the 18th century. Titus suffered greatly in his execution, dying only 2 further days after his initial impalement. So here we have the story, but is this the story of the Huguenots that you were anticipating? And it was important to us that in really looking at the exhibition that we look at all of these nuanced and layered and really complicated stories at the Cape and start to engage with them. So here we have Chandler's plate design, and it includes the backdrop of Table Mountain, you can see there, and exquisite curlicues, of course, of a Cape Dutch farm gable. And other decorative elements include indigenous flowers and a set of official guards walking underneath a slave bell as they're trying to track down and search for Marie and Titus. The tragic lovers are depicted as the original willow pattern, which you can see the birds there, as Angolan swallows in flight, so that's Marie and Titus. The plate was launched on the 1st of September 2017, the day that Marie and Titus were executed in 1740s. And you might also be interested to know that there's also a little porcupine hanging around on the plate, which I thought was quite a sweet touch. But he sells these plates. I really love them. I mean, I always give them as gifts because I think it's just one of the luckiest, most beautiful kind of taking something that was from the east and the west and then bringing it back to a local story. And of course, as I said, in the Huguenot collection, we did have lots of porcelain to work with. We had this Limoges hand-painted dinner service that was made in France for Mr. and Mrs. Charles Christian de Villiers from Cape Town in 1896. This absolutely incredible hand-painted gold filigreed Limoges set. And we had to figure out how we're going to display this in some ways that perhaps illuminated something different about the Huguenots and their lives. So you'll see we set the table, literally, as you, with knives and forks, as you might, might have happened around a family meal. But you'll notice that there's writing underneath it. So we call it Cape Dinner Service, but beneath it, that writing is actually an archival document for the slave office inventories. It's the slaves owned by Paul de Villiers. So we have a double play on the word service, because of course Cape Dinner Service, it's the dinner service itself, but we're also trying to get into the service of the people who are unnamed, the people cooking the meals, the ones who would have been within those households, and serving. You know, it's kind of the unspoken about layer, especially in terms of Huguenot heritage. So this is the list of slaves owned by Paul de Villiers, the owner of the farm of Boschendal. And it kind of gives a list from 1817. So this is in the slave office records in the Cape Archives, which is the SO series. And from about 1815 onwards, all slave owners had to register their slaves. So we find these lists of slaves. Often it's telling you their name, their age, where they came from, whether they're born at the Cape or Mozambique. And sometimes it might, if children are born into a household, it gives their mother's name. It also often gives where their occupation and where they were sold on to, or whether they died, or all these small little side notes might be, it says here, reported to have died on this day, and that's all we sometimes find out, this little comment. So while many of the Huguenots who arrived at the Cape, they actually had very few slaves, so that initial, also perhaps I should say, I keep calling them Huguenots, they never called themselves Huguenots. So that was a term that only came about from about the late 17th century, early 18th century onwards. The Huguenots themselves, in all the documentation in the archives, refer to themselves as the vluchtelingen, the refugees, or the persecuted. So they did not see themselves as this wealthy elite. These were people who were pushed out of France and persecuted for their religion and came to the Cape. And I think it's very telling that they refer to themselves as the refugees. In terms of what they owned, as we can see, it's very little, but later generations, as I said, amassed large slave holdings, so such as Paul de Villiers, who we see here, who by 1824 owned 31 slaves. So agricultural production and wealth was based on the labor of slaves, as well as, of course, indigenous people, which weren't always documented. But wealth at the Cape, this intergenerational wealth, was built through property and slave ownership. Both of those elements, of course, are key elements in these documents in portable inheritance at the Cape. So those two things are the very cornerstone of household inventories and auctions. So that's also something that those documents stand behind. So Charles Christian de Villiers, he and his wife, who had obviously had this Limoges set that we had in the collection, they were a familial descendant of Paul de Villiers. And he grew up in a household in Paul in which it was documented that his grandfather's aged slaves continued to work for the family generations later, even once freed. So that we felt that in displaying this Limoges set, if we didn't acknowledge this process of silencing that hadn't gone on, we would be replicating it all over again. It doesn't make it particularly easy types of displays, but we felt that in the end it provided a more nuanced engagement with who the Huguenots were. So this is just what, in some ways, while these household inventories and auction rolls in some ways are testament to that process of building wealth at the Cape, we've also tried to use it in other ways that actually honour the lives of the people who built the gables and the wine industry and the furniture. So in some cases, like from a census document or a household inventory, on Psalms Delta, we might not have had a name for a slave, we just had a number enumerated, but we tried to represent them individually under each owner: unknown male slave, and sometimes that is the most we know, that they were just a number, but yet they were still an individual. In the auction records, like I said, we can find potentially a little bit more about them: Leander van Malabar, Jeff de van der Kaap, and of course, as you saw in the later slave office records, we can find sometimes their mother, when they were born or died, as well as their occupation. But of course, these aren't their real names. Their own names that were allocated, and their surnames obviously telling you where they came from in the world, but that can be the last port of call where they were enslaved. So their first names, their first indigenous names from the places that they came from, we don't know. But for Psalms Delta, we found that there were 200 slaves that we know of that were living and working on the farm through time. And in some ways, we wanted to try and honour that they had built all of those buildings. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about chairs. How are we doing for time? So chairs is something that also comes up a lot in household inventories and auction rolls. In the early days of Dutch settlement, people had to make do with buckets, barrels, and planks on the floor to do for sitting. So we don't find chairs in the very early inventories. But by the early 1700s, household inventories show that the most ordinary household had no shortage of chairs. So the larger and more established houses had as many as 100 chairs, showing how central entertaining and receiving guests was to social life at the Cape. So chairs were not only treated as seating, but actually also items of repetitive display, especially in public rooms of the household. So say in the Voorhuis or the Voorkamer, we also see images where they're all lined up in a row against the wall. So it's that combination of kind of showing, coming together at the Cape. We were always known as one of the most hospitable and welcoming places, and that's why we have so many chairs. But the architects, builders, and craftsmen responsible for the design and development of Cape Dutch furniture remains largely anonymous. So initially, the people who would have made chairs at the Cape would have been carpenters in the service of the VOC, and they would have reproduced styles or furniture in European styles at the Cape. But of course, by the late 1790s, the master craftsmen were known to be slaves. So wealthy farmers would have had their own masons, smiths, seamstresses, and wagon makers and turners would also have doubled as skilled furniture makers. What's really interesting in comparison to European and Southeast Asian furniture is that Cape-made furniture was characterized by its simplicity and relative lack of ornamentation. So in the end, even though these chairs are being made often by Indonesian slaves, traditional Dutch taste prevailed at the Cape, which I think is obviously part of the style that happened here. And in working with chairs and how we might display that, so we know that chairs were quite a big thing. It's about social gathering and bringing people together. Also, we know that the average number between all these household inventories of chairs that people owned during this period, around the 1740s, was 10 chairs per household. Don't ask me why that's stuck with me, but it has. So here at the Huguenot Museum, they had a really fascinating chair collection that used to be spread out all the way through the exhibition, with incredible styles of Batavian chairs and Cape-made chairs and turn chairs, rupee chairs, and Regency chairs, and we actually put 10 of them, note on a wall, and which was quite a thing to explain why we're putting chairs on the wall. But we wanted to do a kind of double-layered meaning for this exhibition, and the one was to actually tell you the style histories and fascinating, beautiful styles and where they came from. So, for instance, formerly this incredible Indonesian chair of ebony used to be in the exhibition, and the only thing it said was, please do not sit or photograph, which is almost a criminal offense. So during the 18th and 19th centuries, what was really interesting was a tradition in France and other country regions that churchgoers would have to bring their own chairs, known as kerkstoelen, in church services, and owners will often mark their personal chairs with their initials, which was an example that we had amongst this collection as well. But what we also wanted to show in a more conceptual way is that, of course, it was one of the VOC's objectives that their colonies should have a reformed Christian character in line with the wishes of the Reformed Church of the United Netherlands. So the VOC, even though it's a trading thing, they financed church buildings, appointed and paid for church officials, and insisted that the illegitimate offspring of Christian fathers be baptized, and that freed slaves and their marriage partners become Christians at the Cape. So all VOC vessels bound for the east carried a pastoral worker or sick comforter on board. So now the Huguenots enter into this VOC society, and they actually find that it's a very rigid social hierarchy of early VOC Cape society. Everyone had a particular status and place, which they kept trying to change, potentially from what they were wearing and what they were buying. But this actually affected everything all the way down to the seating of people in church. So where you sat mattered. And in terms of, this is what we call the exhibition, keeping places. So within a church, certainly the Stellenbosch church, unlike the men who sat in the church pews, the church pews were allocated to men, the women had to bring their own chairs. So church councils drew up ranking lists to help the verger with this unenviable task of arranging the chairs in the correct social order. You've got to feel sorry for this guy, he was getting in a neck every week. At the head of the church hierarchy would have been the wives of the minister and the landrost, or the magistrate. Next in line in order of age were the wives and the daughters of the heermaden, or the council that assisted the magistrate, and after them came the wives of the surgeons and the wife of the clerk of the court. The rest of the women were placed according to rank, family ties, taking second place. So you could imagine how really interesting those Sunday services must have been, depending whose chair was put where. So that was potentially a more serious take on trying to represent both the style history of these incredible chairs in the collection, but also to try and show the hierarchy of social status even within church seating at the Cape with a Huguenot story. We also felt, though, that chairs potentially could also have a less serious side. So on a Boschendal exhibit we worked on, we decided to, what do? Do we line them up against a wall, all these different types of chairs that they had in the collection? And all of these chairs have incredible designs, and looking at those designs, to me, they had a type of personality. So then we thought, well, why don't we put all these personalities around the table and think about it? Well, what happens if this table was set with chairs, all these different chairs, but that those chairs were typical Cape people? So we kind of personalized them a bit. So you'll see that there's a former military man with stiff upper lip and snore. And this is based on his style of chair, which is a neoclassical chair in dark polished wood with a waisted split flat back and fluted taper legs. The legs have H-shaped stretcher for support and a formerly no-nonsense rumpy seat. Also sitting around the table was the pious dominee, the nosy neighbour, and the delicate family beauty. So the delicate family beauty her style description is a Cape-made 19th century stinkwood tub chair with a delicately pierced back splat, almost a sweetheart hourglass design. Although this type of chair was being made well into the 20th century, it derives from Rococo style with a curved line along the back of the chair, following through to the arms of the chair. We've also got a dashing suitor scoundrel, the gracious matriarch, your wealthy old tunny, and a mad, extravagant uncle. So I also think that sometimes we can play with some of the elements that we find, and of course it's 10 chairs seated around the table, but at the same time we're trying to engage with the types of personalities, but also the fascinating heritage that we have sitting in our chairs and our artifacts and collections. I think I've got another 5 minutes until I can quickly wrap up, and then we have time for questions. So Bibles is another thing that the Huguenot Museum had in abundance. We had over 100 Bibles sitting within that collection. And